Extremists outnumbered 20-1 by the anti-Islamic State coalition. More than 30,000 jihadi fighters engaged in expanding the frontiers of their self-declared caliphate, while the coalition commands more than 600,000 troops made up of Kurdish and Iraqi military backed by Western air and naval forces. But the greater numbers haven't been enough yet to turn the tide against Islamic State. Yegor Piskunov reports from Washington.
Ever since the start of airstrikes on ISIS in Iraq and Syria, President Obama's vision on how deep the U.S. military should get involved in the campaign has been evolving, starting with the complete no-war stance.
As Commander-in-Chief, I will not allow the United States to be dragged into fighting another war in Iraq.
Then to a no-ground war stance.
As your Commander-in-Chief, I will not commit you and the rest of our armed forces to fighting another ground war in Iraq.
And then it got confusing altogether.
The American forces that have been deployed to Iraq do not and will not have a combat mission.
Deployed or not, ground war or combat, the fact is the president sure is under a lot of pressure on the ground troops issue pretty much on all fronts, from current and former military officials.
I, of course, would go back to the president and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
We're not going to send brigades, but there will have to be, I think, to achieve the mission the president has assigned, some American boots on the ground.
To politicians on mainstream media,
they do pose a threat to everything that we care about, and if we're serious about wiping them out, let's go in and get the job done.
And now it seems the U.S. Secretary of State isn't ruling it out either.
The buffer zone is an idea that's been out there. It's worth examining. It's worth looking at very, very closely.
But no matter who's looking into what or how much airtime is given to press the issue on U.S. mainstream media, it will be up to Barack Obama to make the final call. But given how speedy his opinion on deploying U.S. ground troops against ISIS has been evolving in the last 2 months, will the president be able to resist the temptation is the question on everybody's lips. Yegor Piskunov, RT, Washington.
Let's bring in former U.S. Army Judge Advocate Todd Pierce for some perspective on this. Good to have you with us here. The coalition's advantage over Islamists is enormous. Why is that not yet been enough to stop their advance then?
I think if there's anything we should have learned over the last, 50 years going back to Vietnam, is that material advantage doesn't translate into military success. And when you have a people who see themselves as resisting aggression, trying to expel a foreign invader or an occupying army, there's virtually no limit to the will that they bring to the fight. And I think that's where ISIS and their allies in the Mideast have the persistence to keep fighting us, and the people who are opposing them, meaning the other people in the Mideast, are sort of having mixed feelings because they're not really fully on board with keeping the United States in the area either.
But do you really think that's what it is? Because ISIS is as much an enemy, it seems, to the locals as it is to the West in this case. In the case of Vietnam, you have clearly an outside force attacking clearly the locals. But in this case, you have ISIS versus the locals as well. So how are the locals also having that same impetus there, the Iraqis, the Kurds especially?
Well, this didn't just start this summer. It's been going on for a few years, beginning with the war going on in Syria. And according to news reports, U.S. Western Special Forces operations have been training and supplying militants to fight against Assad going back 2 or 3 years now. And what we do know is that many of those arms ended up into what has evolved into ISIS. Then in addition, we fully funded and stocked supplied the Iraqi army, made up of Maliki Shiite faction, more than any other faction in Iraq, that they ended up turning over so many weapons to ISIS that ISIS is pretty well, I think, stocked militarily now, from what I understand. But again, you have to go back a number of years, and from what I've done meeting Guantanamo detainees, is they see this as going back at least to 1990, when the United States would not take forces out of Saudi Arabia at the end of the Gulf War, and then along with some other causes. So they see themselves as expelling the U.S. from that region and restoring some degree of independence, and not the sort that we like to see when we have somebody like the Saudi royal family or the current military rulers of Egypt doing what we ask them to do. So the people see themselves as not only fighting the West, but also fighting the West's proxies in the region. And then you have the combination of the Wahhabism interpretation of Islam that really began to be more radicalized during the Afghan war against the Soviets. But you have people in Saudi Arabia who, and we know Saudi Arabia and some of the other Arab countries were supporting ISIS, so you have this mixed supports. They have a concern for ISIS overflowing, spilling over back in their home countries, but on the other hand, they've been happy to support them in fighting Assad, Syria. And then, of course, nobody can trust the United States anymore because at best we say, well, maybe we'll temporarily suspend this fight against Assad in order to deal with ISIS. But then we always have it, everybody knows that, well, we'll resume this again. General Wesley Clark said right after 9/11 that he couldn't believe that military officers in the Pentagon were talking about taking down, destroying at least 7 countries in the Mideast.
I apologize.
And if you look what's happened over the last...
sorry for jumping in here, but we're running out of time, and I want to get in one more question. Given how the conflict is progressing right now, what are the chances you think that we will see U.S. boots on the ground in the region?
You know, considering domestic politics and what I consider to be a very right-wing militaristic faction of politicians in the U.S., neoconservatives, probably a good chance that we will see boots on the ground yet. And I think that's going to be what will give further fuel to ISIS and strengthen them even more. I think this past summer has strengthened them, and we're able to draw more recruits to their cause than if we hadn't begun fighting and allowed people in the Middle East to try to sort this out and resolve this. They're the ones who are really having to deal with the problem directly anyway.
All right, former U.S. Army Judge Advocate Todd Pierce, thanks for your time.